right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the Theory of the Multiple Reserves. My name is Natalie Vickus, and I will be your host for this session. Today, we are privileged to have Dr. Robert Friedland as our guest speaker. Dr. Friedland will be sharing his knowledge and expertise with us on the theory of the multiple reserves. Before we begin, I would like to remind you that we value your feedback, and this session is eligible for continued education credit, and today's speaker has nothing to disclose. If you would like to receive credit for attending, please stay until the end of the session and complete the evaluation for this session contained in the email you received this morning with the subject line OAC 2023 post-session evaluation link. Be sure you select this session from the drop-down menu when evaluating it. We encourage you to actively participate in the session by putting questions and thoughts in the chat, and we believe the information presented today will be valuable and informative for all of us. Thank you again for joining us, and I hope you enjoy the session. I would like to welcome Dr. Friedland.
Thank you, Natalie. If I could learn about the audience, I know Joe. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. And if Stacy and Vasilina could tell me their background so I can help to manage my concepts. If they could unmute themselves and just tell me so that we could have a conversation rather than a lecture.
I'm not sure if they're able to unmute, but they are definitely welcome to put information in the chat.
So
And I will say hi, Dr. Friedland. This is Anna.
Hello, Anna.
Nice to see you.
Nice to see you. And I've lost all the people. All right. And in any case, could I have my slides? Thank you. You may all know about the concept of cognitive reserve, which is a very valuable idea that the healthier our brain is, the more resistant we are to changes with age. My concept here is that the cognitive reserve concept is valuable, but it's not adequate, because there are other factors that are involved. And I will present this as a theory of multiple reserves, that there are also physical, psychological, and social factors that are important in aging. And the idea of these as reserves helps to illustrate what we need to do and how we need to advise our patients and clients of what they should do in order to have healthy aging and exceptional aging. Next slide, please. I'm grateful for my collaborators in the laboratory, both in Louisville as well as in Kyoto and Cambridge. Next slide. And I appreciate the support from the agencies, foundations, and individuals that have supported our research. Next. This can be framed in regard to these two cases, my concepts. I'd like to reframe our understanding of what aging is. So aging is not only a series of losses. And we can best appreciate our position in aging if we consider the relative outcome in the world, such as here, this 94-year-old man who came to see me every year with the same complaint. I have Alzheimer's disease. And then I said, why do you think you have Alzheimer's disease? He said, I can't remember who wrote The Red and the Black. The Red and the Black is a rather minor novel by Stendhal, at least in my opinion. And forgetting who wrote it is not a sign of Alzheimer's disease. This fellow complained of the pain in his knees. I said, when do your knees hurt? He said, when I walk up the 4 flights of stairs to my office. So I told him that only 8% of men in the United States born 94 years ago are still alive. And out of 194-year-old men, if we could find them, we wouldn't find another one who still goes to work and who still chooses to walk up the stairs to his office. The idea here is that we all need to appreciate our relative position in regard to what happens with aging. So rather than complain, this man should be grateful for his opportunity to still be able to complain. The second case is a man who rode a motorcycle without a helmet. I asked him, "Why do you wear without a helmet? Don't you know how dangerous it is?" And he said, "When you're going to go, you're going to go." And this is a remarkable idea. I said, "Well, when you cross the street, do you look both ways, or do you feel like you're going to go when you're going to go? So why should you waste your time looking? Because you're going to go when you're going to go." And before we conclude that this is a phrase from uneducated people, I have a friend who is a PhD in viral genetics, very accomplished, 76 years old. He's too heavy, he eats meat all the time, and he drinks too much. And if I try to explain to him why he should limit his intake of bad things, he says, "I'm not afraid of dying." And this is very common, people who are in denial of their own responsibility and their own interactions with what happens to them. Next slide, please. The three most important concepts here are attention, attitude, and opportunity. What matters is what we pay attention to, and this determines our attitude. And this affects our ability to appreciate the opportunity of aging. So my practice for over 40 years now has been geriatric behavioral and cognitive neurology. And I get patients and have about an hour with them. That's a limited amount of time, of course, involving my assessment and judgment of what's going on. So I have engaged in the thought experiment. What would I want to tell them if I had an unlimited amount of time? And I did this by, next slide, please, writing this book about the 4 factors that impact how you age. So I have put in here what is the background of aging and what people can do to have exceptional aging. Of course, this is not limited by only what I could say in 1 hour. Next slide. The key points are, in my opinion, aging is not inevitable. Because it's not inevitable, it doesn't happen to everyone. It's an opportunity. And I know here again, when I came up with this idea, I thought maybe I was wrong. Maybe it wasn't assumed to be inevitable by many people. But I've been asking a lot of friends and colleagues, patients, and so on, and it is widely believed that aging happens to everyone. I will explain why that's wrong. This helps us to frame 3 goals of aging. And then certainly everything needs to be done in regard to human evolution. This informs us very much about the opportunity of aging. Next slide. Of course, our goal is not to have normal aging, because most people over 65 have high blood pressure, and at different ages, very high risk of loss of physical functioning and need of assistance. So next slide. Thank you. We don't want to have normal aging. We want to have exceptional aging, or optimal. Optimal aging is another, of course, valuable concept. Next. So what can we do to obtain this. Next slide. I will talk about the foundations about what happens when we get old, why it matters, and the theory of multiple reserves, and then what we can do about it. What can we do about it? As everybody knows, aging is accompanied by declines. These declines are seen here with cellular water, blood flow in the kidney, breathing capacity, and heart output, and so on. And everything declines with aging, every function. Next slide. The only thing which increases with aging is variability. The variability of every function increases with aging. That's because young people are more like other young people than old people are like other older people. This is shown here in this graph of walking speed. You see that most of the data is around the mean, under 60, but once you get over 60, there's more variability. There are more people who are very low or very high. That means there are many people who are not declining with aging. And there are some people who are declining faster than others. So the declines with aging are not inevitable. Not only is aging itself not inevitable, the declines are not inevitable. Of course, I'm not so foolish as to say one can live to be 100 and maintain all the normal functioning of a 50-year-old. That's not possible. However, a 60-year-old patient of mine who smokes, drinks, doesn't exercise, eats badly, and is overweight could be in better shape physically at age 70 than he is at 60 if he does the right thing. So the declines with aging are dependent upon what we do with our lives. Next slide. The key element here is homeostasis. The concept of homeostasis came originally, although he didn't use the word, the great physiologist from France, Claude Bernard, who talked about the milieu intérieur, the stability of the internal environment. Because there's so many declines with aging, the stability or homeostasis of our organism is more delicate. This informs us in knowing how we must enhance the multiple reserves so this stability can be maintained. Next slide. The homeostasis came from Walter Cannon, and it refers to all of the processes responsible for maintaining our stability. And this stability must be maintained despite all the declines that occur. But I think it's important for people to know about this balance and its delicate status, relatively more delicate status with aging. Next slide. So it is this interdependence with the brain, which is related to all the other organs, as well as to psychological and social factors, which is the key, this interdependence. I had originally thought of calling my book The Declaration of Interdependence. However, most people I spoke to thought that was a bit too complicated. Interdependence maybe is too big a word, but it's an interesting concept that everything is related to the brain, and everything about us influences our opportunity for exceptional aging. Next slide. This Dr. Livingston was a prominent gerontologist, in a review said aging is an inevitable part of life. However, I point out that only 86% of people in the US live to be 65. And everybody in this group, listening to me, knows people who didn't live to be old. So everyone does not get a chance to be old. Next slide. And many people don't live that long, and it means that it's not inevitable. It doesn't happen to everyone. Next slide. Perhaps Princess Diana is one of so many examples, and we all know our own personal example. What would she say? What would Diana say if we would tell her that, oh, aging happens to everyone? She would say that, well, it didn't happen to her. I mean, she did age, of course, from birth to 36, but she didn't get a chance to be old. Next slide. We're all one day older than we were yesterday, but we're not all one day older tomorrow. And aging is not synonymous with decline, because there are ways that we can maintain our healthy function without decline. And there are things, this depends on what we do. Next slide. There are many myths about aging. One rather ridiculous comment from the great Oxford physician Osler: the effective work of the world is done before the age of 40. And there's a very long-standing and incorrect and biased view, negative view of aging, which we all must fight against as much as we can. But this is a dominant position in the world. Next slide. To show that Osler was wrong, Darwin wrote a book at 72. Eric Kandel, psychiatrist at Columbia, has just written a book at the age of 92. Next slide. So we can all agree about these goals of aging, at least the first two goals. The main point being, if you recognize aging is not inevitable, it's an opportunity. So my 94-year-old patient I discussed earlier, I told him it's a blessing that he's still alive and that he is able to say he has pain in his knees and that he shouldn't walk up the stairs anymore. So knowing that aging is not inevitable, I hope helps him to understand that it's an opportunity for which he should be grateful. So we can all agree on these first two goals, not dying and not being diseased. But that's not enough. I'm convinced most people are stopping after these two goals. They might say, okay, I've lived to be 70 and I don't have cancer, I don't have heart disease, that's that. I want them to be unsatisfied with these two goals because of the third goal, which is, next slide, please, being fit, having high function, having strong resilience, ability to maintain stability despite stresses which inevitably occur with aging. Next slide. Because the absence of disease is not the same as being healthy. This is especially true for older persons. To put it another way, I want people to understand that what will determine how they do when they're older is related not only to the presence of disease, but also to the presence of fitness. So, of course, it's very well known to this audience that an 80-year-old woman can fall at home, break her hip, go to the hospital, get pneumonia in the hospital, and die. But whether she dies is dependent not only upon the fracture or upon the bacteria, but about her resilience, the resilience of her immune system, of her metabolic capacity, and her cognitive function, and so on. So it's this fitness is the key element of maintaining stability with aging, because it matters what we do. This is particularly in regard to evolution, which we'll talk about, and understanding that genetics is not everything. Genetics is, of course, important, but it's not the only thing. Actually, prevalence and incidence of Alzheimer's disease is declining. This shows that it matters what we do, because the reason it's declining is probably because we are living healthier than we were before. And there are protective factors which can delay onset of these diseases, like Alzheimer's. And they all involve immune mechanisms. And there are some things we can do to enhance our immune system. Next slide. For most human history, we were hunter-gatherers, and we didn't live the way we live now. Also, evolution is not concerned with aging, because old people don't have children. If it doesn't involve the survival or existence of our children, it's irrelevant. There are arguments in the literature about grandparents, and I'm not going to get into that, which of course is very interesting. But in general, I want old people to understand that their resilience is more fragile, and they need to be more concerned with this. And one of the reasons for that is that we are not protected by evolution to have a long life. Next slide. ApoE4 is a risk factor for Alzheimer's disease. And if you have 2 copies, your risk is increased perhaps 12 times. However, people who have 2E4 genes can still have a long life and not get the disease. Some data show 40% of people at age 80 who have 2E4 don't have dementia. This is all to say that there are genetic factors which are important, but they're not the only thing. And they don't determine the disease, except in the 1% of cases who have causative genes. What's important is the interaction of the genes with our environmental factors. Next slide. And these environmental factors influence our survival and fitness. And we'll talk about these 4 reserve factors in a moment, expanding from the cognitive reserve factor. These are all interdependent. Next slide. So reserves refer to military forces that are withheld from action. They're ready for activity and available to serve. So our reserve capacities allow us to have these resilient responses. So we could have 2 patients who are both 70 years old, and they're both obviously survived to be 70, and they may be, both of them do not have cancer and both of them do not have heart disease. But one could have a higher amount of cognitive, physical, psychological, and social reserve, which helps them to be resilient when things happen as they get older. Next slide. The key thing here is what we do influences the development of disease, but what we do also influences how disease affects us. This is particularly true for Alzheimer's, because there are things to reduce the risk of the disease. And these things, these factors I'll talk about, not only influence the risk of the disease, they influence how we're affected by it. Because Alzheimer's takes such a long time to develop, it's possible to have a long life and have Alzheimer's process developing in the brain, which doesn't affect us. And having this outcome is related to what we do. Both of these are influenced by the multiple reserve factors. Next slide, please. Of course, education is protective against dementia, and cognitively stimulating activities we've shown, and many others, both at work and at home, are protective against cognitive impairment. So it's good to have a healthy brain, which is related to what we do during life. It's hard to summarize all of that, but I would say in general, the work of the brain is learning, and it's good to have a life filled with learning. And watching television does not really involve much learning. Next slide. It's not the only thing. Cognitive reserve is not the only matter, because we must consider physical, psychological, and social factors also. Next slide. There's a new paper just from 2022 in PNAS that showed watching TV was associated with increased risk. Actually, we showed this as well almost 20 years ago, that people who watched more TV had a higher risk of getting dementia. Some of this is called reverse causation, because people who have the dementia process beginning may be more passive and watch more TV. But we looked at middle ages and found this relationship to be important. Next slide, please. Physical reserve considers the balance of all the body systems, particularly the microbiota, because the microbiota are our largest environmental exposure. Next slide. So if we sneeze, if we are exposed to a sneeze, let's say in an elevator, that's a risk. That is an environmental exposure, but it only lasts a few minutes. Our bacteria are with us throughout life, from shortly after birth until death. And they're a mass of perhaps 1 kilogram of living organisms. And they have profound influences on metabolism and immunity. Next slide. Just as an example, periodontitis is a risk factor for heart disease, stroke, and Alzheimer's disease. This is the most important or most common bacterial infection in the mouth. With colleagues in Osaka, we have shown that oral bacteria can influence the risk of large and small hemorrhages in the brain. And next slide. It's very interesting that bacteria in the gut influence the microglia in the brain, and the microglia are the immune cells in the brain that are involved in forming and destroying synapses. Bacterial metabolites adjust inflammation in the brain, in the brain. And the molecular mechanism of this is clear, but just the bottom line is a high fiber diet enhances the growth of bacteria that produce autoimmune cells, or that is cells in the blood called regulatory lymphocytes that enhance tolerance. Furthermore, the microbiota can produce amyloid proteins, which can cause processes that are involved in Alzheimer's disease. And we have been working on this and can have a paper published last week in scientific reports showing the influence of these molecules on ALS in transgenic mice. And the bottom line of all of that is it's important to pay attention to diet, because diet influences the bacteria. Next slide. The key factor here, of course, is we evolved with these bacteria, and they evolved with us. And they are dependent entirely on what we feed them. Next slide, please. This interaction can occur involving the gut, the mouth, or the nose. It can go to the spinal cord or the brain, and it can go in both directions. So I found a rather ridiculous thing here is I ask every patient I see, regardless of what's the matter with them, I say they should take care of their oral health, because oral health is good for the brain. And I'm sorry that I have found that other neurologists very rarely or never discuss that with their patients. Next slide. So the health of the body is good for the health of the brain because the brain is dependent. This is especially true in older persons. And this includes every organ, particularly blood pressure, diabetes, and so on. Next slide. Psychological reserve describes the ability to maintain healthy mental function despite stress. And stress develops in everyone in different amounts, of course, as you get older. People who are emotionally more stable have more resilience, and they're resistant to cognitive impairment, even if you have Alzheimer's disease developing in the brain. Of course, our psychological reserve is dependent upon what we do. So I encourage my patients to be socially active, involved in the community as much as possible. I have had patients who are, let's say, 80 years old, and they're widowed, and I find out that they used to play the piano, because I ask every patient, what do they like to do when they're not working? And then I may, at the end of the interview, I may write a prescription. On my prescription pad, I write, play the piano. And I ask them to put it on their refrigerator. Because playing the piano has psychological factors, social factors, and physical factors, as well as cognitive factors. It's a good thing for my patient to be doing. Next slide, please. Importantly, depression leads to inactivity, and that leads to depression, which is a vicious cycle. And we need to do whatever we can. This involves, of course, psychological, social, physical, and cognitive reserve, all of them. Whatever we can do to impair this. So I recommend or advise physical activity for practically every patient. If they're in a wheelchair, they can do exercise with their arms. If they can't walk because of knee pain, they may be able to walk in a pool and get exercise in that manner. Next slide. Social reserve describes their interpersonal networks. And it's good to have more complex social networks when possible. Next slide. Viktor Frankl, the Viennese psychiatrist, said the greatest task is to find meaning. This is particularly critical in aging when patients have the loss of their spouse, the children don't call, and they're no longer working. They've lost meaning. So it's something to consider in each case. What can they do to renew or develop the meaning of their life? Through volunteering, teaching, childcare, of course, care of grandchildren, whatever it is, this is a very critical aspect of social and psychological reserve. Next slide. This is rather a remarkable Tanaka-san is a 90-year-old man in Kyoto, Japan. He lives by this canal. This is a canal that bringing water from Lake Biwa to Kyoto. And behind him, you see a cherry blossom tree. And it was his idea to plant the yellow flowers. We discovered him in Kyoto in October a few years ago, planting these yellow flowers. And I didn't understand why would somebody be planting something in October. And he described how the yellow flowers will grow in the spring and they will complement the beauty of the cherry blossoms. And he did this throughout maybe a length of the canal, about, I don't know, half a kilometer long. And he involved other members of the community, mostly old people, to do the planting. So here we have a concept which is cognitive, physical, social, and psychological. I mean, it's providing him with meaning. It's also providing him with physical activity, cognitive stimulation, and psychological and social interactions. Of course, it's not always possible in this way, but it's just I think, a beautiful example of what I'm talking about with the multiple reserves. Next slide. So the question obviously is, okay, what can you do about it? What can we do to enhance these reserves? And this is a summary of the possible categories of things that can be done. Next slide, please. We can't say which activities are particularly good for which of the reserves because they're all interdependent, as I showed with Mr. Tanaka. Next slide. I say we can do gene therapy in the kitchen. By that, I mean, by changing our diet, we change the genes in our microbiota. And we actually have more genes for bacteria than we have genes for ourselves. And we can change the microbiota in the gut by changing our diet in a period as short as 2 weeks. And this can have a beneficial effect on biomarkers of health and disease, including cancer. Next slide, please. Fiber is a particularly important concept in fruit and vegetables, nuts and raisins, and there is no fiber in meat. So a 16-ounce steak has no fiber. A 16-ounce steak provides no nutrition for the good bacteria. It does provide nutrition for bacteria that make enhance the production of Th17 cells, which are inflammatory. And inflammation is a component of Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, ALS, and cancer. Next slide, please. I recommend the dietary elements shown here, particularly, I would say, vegetables and plants. Also, a component of, I think his name is Daniel Pollan, who said the key recommendation about diet is eat food. That means no processed food. Processed food is not food. Next slide. I'm not aware of any need to eat white bread. A high salt diet is actively inflammatory. And soda, either with or without sugar or with artificial sugar, is not good for the microbiota. Next slide. So I recommend a plant-based, low-saturated fat diet with little meat. And next slide. The key part here is diet affects the brain, not only through the microbiota, but in large part through the influence on the bacteria. Next slide, please. Both sugar and salt enhance this. According to Yuval Harari, Israeli historian, McDonald's and Coca-Cola pose a greater threat to our lives than Al-Qaeda or the Islamic State. And artificial sugars have negative effects on the microbiota. Next slide. Green tea may have good effects as an antioxidant and anti-inflammatory agent. Next. Physical and mental exercise both are critical. Next slide. Here's another view of the yellow flowers with the sakura, but outdoor activities are important. This study showed that outdoor activities are more effective than antipsychotics for physical aggression and dementia. So the problem there is nobody's going to make money about recommending outdoor activities. It's not a pill. And this is a big problem with our healthcare system, but it's worth consideration. Maintaining a socially active lifestyle is good for cognitive reserve and benefits cognitive function. Next slide. I recall telling a patient who was he had cognitive impairment and he was drinking 6 ounces of bourbon a day. I told him that his liver, he was 84. I told him that, Mr. Feldman, I'm sorry to tell you, your liver is 84 years old. And that it could handle it perhaps all throughout his adult life. But now that he's 84, his liver function will be less able to metabolize alcohol. And it may be too much at his age. And polypharmacy is a leading cause of reversible dementia, which requires a lot of attention. Next slide, please. Meditation can help with all of these. It helps us know that we can choose one thought over another. And meditation is practice in letting go. Depending on what kind of meditation you like, usually it involves the ability to allow your thoughts to come and allow your thoughts to leave. My favorite phrase about this is you let them come in and you let them leave. You just don't invite them for tea. Next slide, please. You may all be surprised to hear this from a neurologist, but evolution has developed good mechanisms by which the brain can be protected from multiple blows to the head. Next slide. Only in woodpeckers. Next slide. Woodpeckers have ways to smash their head into a tree and not get hurt, but it doesn't apply to humans. And over 80% of college football players have been shown to have CTE in autopsy studies. And in my opinion, young people, including college students, should not play football. Next slide, please. Salutogenesis is the generation and maintenance of health. Both pathogenesis and health are influenced by these lifestyle factors. It can influence the reserve as well as influence the expression of disease. Next slide. In conclusion, this is all best approached as a form of personalized medicine. So Francis Collins says personalized medicine is using genetic information to assist in medical care. But this is what every doctor should have been doing for the last several hundred years. The key component of the reserves is personalization. So it's kind of hard to do that in clinic when we're in a hurry from patient to patient. But we need to know what kind of patient we have. That's maybe important, just as important to know what's the matter with them. Next slide. And the key component is diversity, not only of diet, but also diversity of activities and diversity of social contexts. Next slide. And this involves early life as well as later life. There are fewer studies about early life because it's hard to link outcomes in late life with what people do in early life, but there is data about this involving these factors shown here. I wrote a paper with Carol Brain 20 years ago entitled, "What Should the Pediatrician Know About Alzheimer's Disease?" Because I thought that lifestyle habits begin in childhood, and that's the best time for healthy activities to be developed, like don't eat soda, be physically active, don't watch too much television, and don't smash your head into the other people. However, in the last 20 years, the paper has never been cited. Next slide. So in conclude, because aging is not inevitable, it's an opportunity, and we must work to enhance these reserves, to maintain resilience, and increase the opportunity that aging represents. Next slide. Finally, the word opportunity comes from a favorable wind coming to port. That's where the PORT and opportunity comes from. I think it's a beautiful concept when you think about a ship coming to port cannot do it without wind in the old days when ships didn't have any motor. And that is what our realization of opportunity is. We must realize the opportunity or the occasion to use favorable winds. Next slide, please. Because it makes a difference what we do. And next. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'd be delighted to have your questions.
Dr. Friedland, we do have some questions in the chat. Would you like for me to read those to you, or can you see them?
I'm looking at the chat. Okay, thank you. Social worker. So thank you, Joe, for this question. Why is there resistance in the medical system to promote what you've been doing? A part of it is what I said earlier, that nobody's going to make money out of that. And this takes time. And I'm just working on a paper just today, saying that it's really a shame that there's so much concern in the Alzheimer community about these drugs. And billions of dollars have been spent trying to develop monoclonal antibodies. And the basic fact is that they don't work. But if they could spend some of that money on enhancing physical activity in older people, that would be more rewarding or more valuable. But this is a good question. The answer, I don't know. Like, why don't neurologists tell every patient they need to get a herpes zoster vaccine? Every patient over 50. It's recommended by the CDC for everyone over 50, with some very rare exceptions. And it's a neurological disease. Why shouldn't every neurologist tell every patient over 50? But they don't do it because our healthcare system is based on illness. It's not based on function or health. So for U of L, our mission statement is about patient care, patient-centered care. I think this is wrong. I would like them to say person-centered care, because persons include people who are not patients. We should be concerned with the function and reserve capacities of persons, not only disease. And how do we get doctors to focus in this area, or to speak? I'm sorry, Barbara, that's a wonderful question. And it's very depressing to consider that it's just not happening. And like there are fewer geriatricians being trained, even though there are, of course, more older people. And again, a good example is in Japan, if you're over 65, you can ride a bus for free. This is a good thing because it helps older people often who don't have much money. It keeps them more active, and by having them more active, their healthcare costs will go down. So I would propose that Medicare, which spends several $1,000s on every person over 65, of course, every year, they should be paying patients to take classes and join the gym. And if they did that, that would be cost effective because healthcare costs would go down and Medicare would save money. What are my thoughts on genetic testing? Right. If Alzheimer's disease mutations are causative, but they're only responsible for 1% of cases. And almost all of these cases have onset before the age of 60 or 65. So if you have a mother or aunt or something, or a bunch of them who have dementia in their 70s or 80s, that means that they do not have a causative mutation. However, they may have genes increasing risk. But to do genetic testing will not help because there's nothing we can do differently. Everything I recommended today applies to anyone, regardless of what the genetic risk is. And I'm concerned that younger people may be tested and then have a period of literally 60 years where they can worry about it. And then when they get to be 85, they could say, well, you know what? I didn't have to worry about it the last 60 years because I didn't develop it. I didn't get it after all. So you can get Alzheimer's disease without any risk factor genes. And you can avoid the disease. You can live to be 90 and not get it, even if you have 2 copies of V4. If there was something special you should do, depending on the genetic risk, then everybody would be tested, should be tested. But that is not the case now, despite what people say. Lecanemab is a monoclonal antibody for Alzheimer's disease. It is effective in removing the amyloid for the brain. However, it causes brain swelling and hemorrhages, and it causes brain shrinkage, and it's been associated with 3 deaths. And it is modestly effective. So it reduced the progression of the disease, according to 2 tests, by a factor of 27%. And in my opinion, this is a small change which is likely to be clinically meaningless. And I have decided I will not use it. It's also too expensive. I think the positive results, which I just said were modest, may have been caused by the loss of blinding and placebo effect. I don't know what I recommend the dietary factors to every patient, and some of them do change their diet, but many of them don't. And I recently was in Japan for meetings and met with my brother-in-law who read my book, but used the opportunity to eat as much beef as possible because the beef in Japan is very good. So there's only so much you can do, and you can't, you can lead a horse to water, so to speak. And I'd be happy to have any other questions. Hello. Hello.
I don't believe there are any more questions in the chat at this time. Let me ask the audience, do you have any more questions?
Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Friedland. This was very, very good. Thank you so much for sharing with us.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
That will conclude our breakout session. Please join us for the closing session at 1:15.